Let's now speak with Iain Mansfield. Iain is Director of Research at Policy Exchange. He's also a former advisor to 3 Conservative education ministers. Hello, Iain. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
So how are you going to get this kind of magic thing of reducing the deficit without raising taxes?
So I think the first thing to say is that this isn't something that can be done with just a few efficiency savings or waste. I'm not saying there isn't any efficiency, but to get the really big numbers, you have to look at the big spending lines, which means pensions, welfare, and health. And I'm not saying these are things that anyone would want to do, but we're in a situation where we are on interest payments alone, we're spending 111 billion a year. That's £1,500 for every man, woman and child in the country that's not going on public services or on anything we care about, but just paying the interest on our debt. And that's at the heart of why we say we have to bring public spending down. If I just go through a couple of the big ones.
Yeah, please do.
We say it's time to end the triple lock. We call to freeze the state pension for 3 years and from then on go up by inflation, which would save over £22 billion. We're looking at saving nearly £30 billion from welfare, which includes getting the number of claimants back to pre-pandemic levels, as well as, again, a 3-year freeze on most working age benefits. And then we also are looking at around 10 billion from health. I should be clear, that's not an actual cut. That would be based on the budget rising slightly slower than it's currently planned to over the next 5 years. These are obviously big changes, but we have been living beyond our means for a number of years now, for 7 or 8 years at least. And this is the sort of thing that's needed if we're going to start bringing the budget back under control.
Right. So you've set out some quite, as you say, some kind of 3 big ticket areas. I suppose let's start with pensions. The difficulty is, as we saw from the government's attempts to do winter fuel allowance, which I have gone on the record and I think they got that wrong, and I think the way they did it was wrong. I think that there was a kernel of an idea there, but I think they went about it the wrong way. But what was really interesting was the absolute backlash to taking a winter fuel allowance. And I think, and look, you've worked as a special advisor to Conservative ministers, I've worked as a special advisor to Labour ministers. Political parties are really anxious about doing anything that affects pensioners because they're the ones that go out and vote. How do you sort of break that, Iain?
Yeah, so I think there is I would agree with you here that they did go about it the wrong way with the winter fuel allowance. And I think that partly that's they didn't set it up in the right way and make the case for it. And I think if you look before 2010, David Cameron and George Osborne had been campaigning for 2 years on the need to live within our means, whereas the winter fuel allowance came out of nowhere. But I actually think there's something a little bit deeper here. And it's that for the last few years, governments have been trying to do very incremental things, triangulating just a little bit. And it's not worked. I mean, it didn't work for Rishi Sunak last summer. We saw that. And if we look at the polls, it's not working for Keir Starmer. So if you take the winter fuel allowance, that was going to raise about 1.3 billion on the original proposals. It met, as you said, with an enormous backlash. But 1.3 billion is really neither here nor there in the case of the debt. If you did something like this, a major change, breaking the triple lock, yes, that would cause a backlash. And you would obviously have to combine it with savings elsewhere, or potentially even, Rachel Reeves may want to throw in a tax rise and so forth. But if you are raising 22 billion, then you can actually do things that people care about. So a Labour government, we haven't said this in our paper at Policy Exchange, because we focused on spending cuts, but a Labour government, for example, could use 4 billion of that 22 billion to end the 2-child cap on benefits. That would be something which they and their supporters want to do. It would show we're all in it together, and they'd still have 18 billion left to help reduce the deficit. When you often get just as much backlash from a small but iconic change than if you do something that's really big and strategic. And I guess the final thing I'd just say on that is that governments have been worrying too much about how they're going to poll the next week. But again, if we go back to the 2010 period, throughout all of 2012, the Conservatives were 10 points behind Labour. But because they had a plan, and we can point to Labour leaders as well who have had plans and have delivered them, they were able to make the hard choices at the beginning. And then they were able to get it so that the country could see the results by the time it came to the next election. And we need that sort of strategic long-term thinking from our politicians.
So let's take the area of welfare, which of course the government's had quite a bruising experience with when they tried to reform welfare PIP payments, had a huge backlash from their new very big intake. And that's now been shelved. We were reporting yesterday that sort of those plans are kind of off the table. Stephen Timms is doing some review, but that's basically kind of kicking things into the long grass. Now, Pat McFadden has recently been moved to the DWP department. It's been briefed out that the government does want to come back and do some welfare to work planning. They want to try and particularly target younger people, and many of them not in education or training or work. But the difficulty with that, Iain, is that if you want to do a very, a good faith welfare to work plan, which I'm sure everybody would get behind, particularly for younger people, probably people of all ages and stages of life, it's quite difficult to do that and get immediate costs. It's the kind of thing you have to put a bit of money into first, and then you may well see reductions in terms of the benefit bill down the track. It's quite difficult just to sort of cut welfare and get people into work immediately.
Well, there are maybe areas where you have to put some money in. I think one, not in this latest report, but in a report we did a month ago looking at SEND and mental health amongst young people, we talked about increasing the mental health budget for the young in terms of prevention is better than cure in terms of this. But I think if we do look at the welfare budget, I think realistically you're right. The current Labour government, after its defeat earlier this summer, would find it difficult to make the scale of welfare savings that we say are desirable in our paper for policy exchange. But there are actually things that one could do. I think, as you say, you want to be good faith about this. It's a tragedy for many of the individuals involved, especially those in their 20s who are going on to out of work benefits with no work requirements, perhaps due to mental health conditions, and they may be real. But if they are signed off from work for 1 or 2 years, they may never get back into the workplace. And one of the things which has really changed in our system, it started in the pandemic, but then it's continued afterwards, is the move away from in-person assessments. And actually, we can really see there is a strong correlation because it's much harder to assess someone if it's an online thing, and you could move back to in-person assessments. That alone, without any sort of cuts to headline rates or freezes, that's the sort of thing which we could be doing to start actually changing the dial on this. And of course,
would that cost money, Iain, in terms of, because I think you're totally right on that. By the way, I think face-to-face could help with a lot of things. I mean, it's a slight sidebar issue, but we've just had that big story about what happened in Chelmsford in terms of the mistaken release. And actually quite a lot of prison people I've spoken to saying, and I've had police people say this as well, is that one of the things post-pandemic is when they're doing recruitment, they do it online rather than face-to-face. It saves time and money. But I actually think that's money well spent and time well spent doing things like that face-to-face. I think it's the same with these assessments. But the argument is it's more cost-effective to do these things online. So would that cost money?
I'd say it's I think if we compare the two, the assessments, you're still paying the qualified staff to do them online. So you're paying a small amount for the extra cost of a face-to-face. But when you think about just one person who's then in work instead of on benefits, and the cost of that over an entire year, both the savings on benefits, but also the tax they would pay from that employment, this is a reform which would pay for itself within the first year. It's not something where you're investing for a potential savings 5 years' time, which is obviously much more difficult. You would get returns on that, significant returns, within the first year of a government implementing that sort of policy. Now, of course, there are some other things which are much harder. There are questions around eligibility for certain benefits. For example, on the Motability scheme, the eligibility requirements on, should planning a route actually be counted in the same way as other more physical difficulties in this current world of Google Maps and so forth. I think there's some real questions about that, but they would undoubtedly be more controversial, as we've seen. But I think ultimately we do need to look at this. There are 5,000 people a day signing on to out-of-work benefits. That's doubled in just a few years. Some of that may be due to after effects of COVID or of social media, but I don't think it's all that, and we're not doing people a service by allowing this to happen.
Well, look, Iain, what an interesting conversation. It's really interesting to have that. I'm sure people have got sort of views on this. I'm sure many people will agree with you. I'm sure many people will disagree with you as well, but it's a really interesting paper looking at some of these big ideas. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
That's Iain Mansfield from Policy Exchange.